Rabbi, we're on DAF Tzadi Tes Amud Aleph at the top line. We were learning yesterday about the transportation of the krushim, of the beams on the wagons in the desert, and applying that to what defines a Rishus HaRabim. So we continue this discussion of the different things that were used in the construction of the Mishkan. Tana Rabbanan, Yirios HaTachtonos Shel Tcheles V'Shel Argamon V'Shel Tolah Shani V'Shel Sheish. The lower covers of the or the curtains of the Mishkan, the things we talked about. There was a lower layer of fabric and a higher layer of animal skin, and so the lower layer, which was made of fabric, was made of blue thread, crimson thread, and scarlet thread, and it was made of linen, and the other materials are wool. And ve'elyonos, that's the way they're conventionally translated. Ve'elyonos shel maaseh izim. And the upper cover, which was made out of animal hide, was made out of goat skin and goat hair, as we'll see in just a minute. In other words, what's that? The goat hair was connected to the goat hide. Ugedola chachma shenemra be'elyonos yosemi shenemra betachtonos. That there was an even greater amount of wisdom in the artisanship that went into the manufacture of the upper cover than the lower cover. Now you would say that's counterintuitive, because an animal hide you would think doesn't take a lot of processing. But the reality is that even though the lower cover was weaving, it had to be woven a lot more labor intensive, but there was even more labor intensivity when it came to the skins. And why is that? Because the ilu betachtonos ksiv v'chol isha chachmas leiv biyodeha tavu, that it says by the fabric, it says that every woman who was of wise heart wove with her hands. The ilu belyonos ksiv v'chol hanashim asher nasa liban osana bechachma tavu esa'izim. All women whose hearts elevated themselves, it sounds like an even greater amount of wisdom, elevated them with wisdom, wove the goat covers. V'tanya mishum Rabbi Nechemia shatuf ba'izim v'tavui min ha'izim. That Rabbi Nechemia had explained that what happened was, and I don't know why this was, but for whatever reason it got a higher quality result, is that what the women would do is that they would weave the goat's hair while they were still alive on the backs of the goats, and then the goats would be killed, they would flay the hides, and then they would be able to use the already processed hair. And I don't know exactly what the process was, but that's what it seems to me, is that they were taking goat skins that already had this woven hair that was connected to it, and that was used as the cover. I think that's the way. I mean,
the article says they actually use the hair. They shore it like a sheep, but they braided it while it was on the goat. And
they braided it while it was on the goat, and then they removed it. They didn't use the animal hide itself.
That's what it says in the article.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay. I have to defer to the art scroll.
So it's a Beferish art scroll.
Yeah. Okay.
It is Sforno. It comes from Sforno.
Okay. All right. It could be. All right.
Yeah, so you're getting longer strands, and you're able to braid it.
Okay. Shtei gezustraos chulei. We had seen in the Mishnah that if you have two blocks that are coming out of the wall on either side of a Rishus HaRabim, and you throw from one block to the other, you're pater, because, like we said, that was analogous to lateral passing from one wagon to the other in the desert. And that wasn't typically done. And since that was not typically done, that's not considered to be one of the malachos that went into the construction of the Mishkan. So Amar Rav Mishum Rabbi Chia, Agalos Tachtein Uvenein Vitzidein Rishus HaRabim. So related to this idea is that the wagons, we had seen this yesterday, the wagons, all around the wagons, underneath the wagons and in between the wagons and on the sides of the wagons on the outside, are all considered to be Rishus HaRabim. Amar Abaya ben Agala la Agala kimelo orech Agala. So Abaya says that the distance between one wagon and the other, side to side, was the same distance as the length of the wagon bed. Remember, we learned that the wagon bed was how many amos? It was 5 amos. The kama orech Agala he amos. And it was the wagon bed's length was 5 amos, and you created either 3 or 4 stacks of beams, remember we had learned that this was two different opinions in the Gemara, whether they were stacked flat, so that along the wider end, the wider bottom, which would be 3 stacks of 1.5 amos, or were there 4 stacks of stacking the beams on their narrower side, which would be 4 stacks of 1 amma. Okay, so the Gemara's question therefore is, so then lama li, the daladu palgasagi, and why do you need a full 5 amos for the wagon bed? 4.5 amos would be enough. If the most that you need is 3 stacks of 1.5 amos each, then that it should suffice with a 4.5 amma bed. So the Gemara says, Ki heichi de lo lidchaku karashim. The answer is, like we had explained yesterday, you need to have a slight gap in between the stacks, because otherwise the beams would be knocking against each other, and it would cause some kind of abrasion and perhaps wearing down on the beams. So when they were transported, you wanted to make sure that there was some space in between the stacks. And that's why you needed, instead of 4.5 amos, which would just make it to fit exactly, you needed to have additional little bit of extra space. Amar Rava, tzidei agala kimelo rachav agala. And so Rava now said that the sides of the wagon are the same width as the width of the wagon bed itself. Remember, we had said that the wagon bed is rectangular. It's 5 amos long and 2.5 amos wide. And the sides of the wagon, which means the wheel structure on either side, supplemented the width to a full 5 amos. So it's like 1.25 amos on each side for the wagon wheels and the space for the wheels. The kamarocha v'agala shtei amos umechza. So what was the width of the wagon bed? It was 2.5 amos wide. So the Gemara says, Lamali, why do you need to have such a wide wagon bed? Ba'amsa upalga sagya. Wouldn't it be enough to just have 1.5 amos of a wagon bed width in order to accommodate the placement of the crushing? Now, this is a little bit strange, and I don't have a full solution to this, why the Gemara says specifically 1.5 amos. Rashi says that if you were to stack the crushing on their narrower side, which would be the 1 amos depth side, then all you would need in order to balance the beams is a bed that was only 1.5 amos wide. I don't know why that is. I guess Rashi's assumption is that the width of the beam going across only needs a slightly wider bed in order to support it and balance it properly. But just imagine for yourself a second, you're balancing a very long beam on top of a wagon using the balance weights of either side in order to balance it in the center on top of this bed. So the Gemara says it seems a little bit overkill to have 2.5 amos, so that basically what you have, if you have 2.5 amos width of the wagon bed, so then you'll have 3 and 3 3/4 and 3 and what is it? If it's you'll have 7.5 on both sides. 7.5 divided by 2 is 3 3/4. 3 3/4. 3 3/4 sticking out on either side. So the Gemara says you could actually get by with a little bit more sticking out. You don't need such a wide wagon bed. And so therefore the Gemara says, why do you need a 2.5 amma wide wagon bed? The answer is because otherwise it would become too wobbly. In other words, every time you went over a bump in the desert, the beams would start to wobble and and to jostle, right? Or even a slight bump. It was rough, yeah. Now Tosfos is very bothered by this whole depiction, the way Rashi describes it. And Tosfos says that even with a 2.5 amma wide wagon bed, you're still going to have a lot of wobbling when you have such a wide beam of 10 amos going across.
No springs.
So yeah, right. No shock absorbers. Yeah, right. So Tosfos has he quotes Rabbeinu Tam. This is a totally different explanation. He says that the two wagons that were side by side were actually hitched to each other, and instead of having an individual stack on each wagon, you had one beam going across and balancing both ends of one beam. So you had stacks only only individual stacks of 3 or 4 for both wagons, going on top of both wagons together to hold it. That's the way Tosfos holds, and that answers a lot of the questions of why the Gemara asks, well, it should suffice with 1.5 and so forth. But the bottom line is that this is the Machlokas Rashi and Tosfos. But we'll continue learning like Rashi just for consistency. So the Gemara now says the next question the Gemara asks is Ela dekaimal on derech reshus harabim sheishes rei ama. We know that the definition of a reshus harabim has to be at least 16 amos wide in order for it to be constituted as a public thoroughfare. And this is actually brought down in the poskim, that one of the definitions of a reshus harabim, let's say you have a highway, the highway has to be at least 16 amos wide in order to be considered a true reshus harabim. So anan de gamrinan la mi mishkan de mishkan chamisri havai. Now we get that number from somewhere. We must get it from the way that the Mishkan traveled in the desert. And if when you do the math, if the wagons are 5 amos wide each, and there's a 5 amma gap in between the two wagons, all you get is 15. So where did he get the 16th amma from? So the Gemara answers, Amsa Yisera Havai Dahavakoi Ben Levi Dichmishtalfi Kroshim Adanakit Lahu. Answers the Gemara that you have to add an additional half amma on the outside of either side, because there was a Levi that was always walking behind the wagons. I guess one Levi behind each pair of wagons from behind, and he would always be observing to see if there was any wobbly crushing. And as soon as he noticed something was starting to jostle, he would immediately run over to catch on the outside of the wagon to stabilize the beams, to hold on to them and stabilize them and readjust them. And as a result, the half amma on the outside where the Levi would have the opportunity to stand is considered to be part of the pathway of the wagons, and that's where you get a total of 16. Here too, you have a question on Rashi. The question on Rashi is that if you got 2 stacks of beams that are traveling side by side, you don't have just 16, you have now 20. This is a question that Rashi himself asks. And Rashi answers that the beams, as they were resting on the wagons, were higher than 10 tefachim. So you only look at the space underneath the beams, and since underneath the beams it ends at 15 or 16 amos now for the room for the Levi to walk, that's why you don't look at the birth of the beams themselves that are protruding outward.
Where does Tosfos, for instance, get this idea that the wagons were hit? I mean, does he just figure it must be that because
otherwise the physics, the engineering doesn't work.
How can you travel so far a distance with only a small space between 2 wagons unless they were physically attached to each other? I mean, one moves this way, you got a little depression here, you got a rock. So it must be attached, the two together, in order to hold at such a small space.
That would be smashing into each other.
Right.
I guess you'd have to ask Lauren Green from Bonanza. I'm not sure exactly. Someone told me that he was Jewish. Lauren Green.
Yeah.
Jewish guy from Montreal. Anyway, okay. Toronto boy. Okay.
Everyone's a Canadian.
Everyone's Canadian. Yeah. Okay, let's go. I opened up a can of worms. All right, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Okay.
We know our Bonanza, right?
Raymond Burr also.
Raymond Burr, okay.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. Weiter. Next Mishnah. Next Mishnah. Cholis habor ve'hasela shehin gavoa nasara v'rachvan arba'a. That here now we have 2 types of reshus hayachid that are in the middle of a reshus harabim. One is where you have a depression in the ground that goes 10 tefachim deep, and the other one is where you have something protruding out of the ground that is 10 tefachim high, and in both cases it's 4 by 4 tefachim in floor dimension. So you have a rock that is either 10 tefachim high and 4 by 4 in dimension, or a pit that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 by 4. And here the Mishnah says something slightly bizarre. It says cholis habor, that you have the mound that's around the bore, that with that mound it makes up 10 tefachim, or a rock that goes up 10 tefachim. So hanotel mehen v'hanosin al gabam chayev pachos mikein potter. So if you transfer from reshus harabim onto this rock or into the bore, you're going to be chayev because you transfer from reshus harabim to reshus hayachid. But if the height or the depth of the rock or the pit is less than 10 tefachim, then it's not a reshus hayachid, and therefore you're going to be potter. So the Gemara's question is, Lamali lemisni choiles habor vehasela. Why was it necessary for the Mishnah to say specifically that you're talking about a pit with a mound around it, a mound of earth that sort of forms the lip around the pit? Just say lisni habor v'asila. Just say a regular pit that's 10 tfachim deep, or a rock that goes up 10 tfachim high. So the Gemara says, Nisayei leila Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan bor v'chulisa mitzarfen la'asara. The answer is to tell me a chiddush like Rabbi Yochanan says. That the chiddush is that let's say the pit is not a full 10 tfachim deep. Let's say it's only 8 tfachim deep. But there is a lip that goes above the bore that is 2 tfachim high. Okay, or like a little wall around the pit. So the chiddush is that even though part of the 10 tfachim height of this pit is underground and part of it is above ground, we still say that since in total, if you were standing inside the pit, you would perceive a 10 tfachim height a hole in the ground, therefore it's considered to be a rishus hayachid. That's the chiddush, that you can conjoin the part that's above ground with the part that's below ground. Tanya no mihachi, we have a brisa to support that principle, which says, the brisa says as follows: the rishus harabim amuka yud urachava arba'a, that when you have a rishus harabim that is 10 tfachim deep and 4 tfachim wide, ein mamalin hemenu b'Shabbos, you may not draw anything out of that pit or pull anything out of that pit on Shabbos into the rishus harabim. Eli imkein asula mechitza gavoa yud tfachim, unless you make a partition or a wall before Shabbos around that pit, around that well, so that by the time that you walk into the vicinity of the well, you're now in a rishus hayachid because it's bounded by partitions. Ve'ein shosin hemena b'Shabbos. Furthermore, let's say you don't want to draw anything out of the well, but you want to lean over and drink from the water of the well. So that also you're not allowed to do. Eli imkein hichnas larosh v'rubo, unless the majority of your head and body is leaning over the well, which means as follows. Let's say you just want to lean your head over the well and the remainder of your body is outside the well. That too is usher. Why? Because we're worried that you may inadvertently pull the water out of the well and into rishus harabim. It's only if the majority of your body is leaning over the well that you're allowed to drink the water. Then of course you just got to be careful, don't fall into the well. Now, ubor v'cholisa mitzarfin lasara. And the final point of the brisa, which is the support to what we just said, is that the indentation in the ground can be conjoined with the area of wall above the well to make a total of 10 tfachim. Okay, that was the whole point of this brisa. Va'amine Rav Mordechai me Rabba. Rav Mordechai asked Rabba the following question: Amud b'rishus harabim gavoa yud v'rachav dalet. Let's say you have some kind of pillar that's standing in rishus harabim. It's 10 tfachim high. It's 4 by 4 tfachim. V'zorak v'nach al gabav, and you throw a projectile that lands mamish on top of the pillar. So what's going to be the halacha? Mi amrinan harei akira be'isr harei hanacha be'isr. One possibility is, this most simple understanding is, you did an akira in rishus harabim, you throw it and it lands on a rishus. You do an akira in rishus harabim, you throw it and it lands on top of a rishus hayachid. So you should be liable for doing a malacha. Oh dilma, but the other side of it is, kaven demimakom pitur ka'asya lo. Let's think about this for a second. In order for a projectile to land on top of an object that is 10 tfachim high, there has to be an arcing of the projectile so that at some point it's higher than 10 tfachim in the air. And we learned that when you throw a projectile in a rishus harabim above 10 tfachim, where is it now? It's in a makom pitur. It's not in a rishus harabim anymore. So the thinking of the possibility why we can be lenient over here is that since this projectile is traveling via a makom pitur, and we learned before that if you transfer from a rishus harabim to a makom pitur, and then from a makom pitur to rishus hayachid, you're pater. So maybe so too here, because you're throwing it through the air and it's going through a makom pitur before it lands on the rishus hayachid. Maybe you should be pater over here. That's the thinking. So Amar Lei mas nisanhi. So Rabbi answered to him. He says, "No, come on. It's a clear Mishnah that you're going to be chayiv. It's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that when you transfer from a rishus harabim into a pit or onto a big rock, that's a rishus hayachid. You're going to be chayiv. So the same thing is when you throw the projectile. So Asa Shaila Rav Yosef. He asked Rav Yosef, Amar Lei mas nisanhi. Asa Shaila Labayim Lei mas nisanhi. He asked Rav Yosef gave him the same answer. He asked Abaye, Abaye says, come on, what's the question? It's a Mishnah. So Amar Lahu, Kulchu Beruka Dahadadi Tafisu. He said to them, you all spit with the same saliva. That's what, it's basically, it's a way of saying that you all speak the same way, you all come up with the same idea. And it's a bit of a criticism when you think about it, because what he's essentially telling them is that none of you are creative in your thinking. You're all thinking within the box. Okay? So Amar Lahu, yeah, within the pit. So Amar Lahu, Va'at lo tispira. So they said to him, come on, what's your complaint? Don't you have to agree to what we said? That if you, it says very clearly that if you take something out of the pit or off the rock, or if you put something on the rock, then you're going to be chayiv. So Amar Lei, so he said to them, no, not necessarily so, because Dilma masnisin b'machat, because maybe our mission is talking about when you're throwing a needle, which has almost no mass. So they said back to him, machanami yefshadilo medalya purta. So he says, but they said, but even a needle has to arc a little bit when you throw it. So invariably, even the smallest object is going to get up into a makom bitur before it can land on top of an item that's 10 tvachim high. So the answer to him is the islay mursha. Maybe we're talking about a case where the rock has a knob protruding out of its side, and when you throw the needle, it never goes above 10 tvachim in our Mishnah, and it lands on the side of the rock, which is also the entire part of the rock. Any surface where something would normally rest on that rock is a rishus hayachid, and that's why you're chayiv. But in reality, if the object would go above 10 tvachim, you'd be pater. Inami de ramya becharitza, or maybe there's a groove or a cleft in the rock where the object can rest, and it doesn't have to go above. So that was the argument that Rav Mordechai is giving. So Amarav Misha boy Rabbi Yochanan. So Rav Misha said that Rabbi Yochanan asked the following question: Kosel v'rishus harabim gavoa yud ve'eno rachav arba. And another similar kind of thought question. He says, let's say you have a wall that is abutting a rishus harabim. Now the wall itself is not a rishus hayachid because it's not 4 tfachim wide, but it is 10 tfachim high, this wall. And so if you were to place something on it, you would not be chayiv because it doesn't qualify as a rishus hayachid. At the most, it would qualify as a carmelis, right? Because it's 10 tfachim high, but it's not 4 tfachim wide. So you certainly would not qualify this as a rishus hayachid. However, umukaf lekarmelis v'asor rishus hayachid. However, the catch here is that what is the function of this wall that's abutting rishus harabim? It now encloses an empty lot, and the purpose of the wall was to now make this empty lot a place of habitation, to make it into a rishus hayachid. So the function of the wall is to cause a piece of property to become a rishus hayachid, and it's abutting the rishus harabim. V'zorak v'nachal gabav mahu. So you then throw a projectile and it lands on top of the wall. What will be the halacha? Mi amrinan keven de'ino rachav dalid makom peturhu. Could you argue that since the wall is not 4 by 4 tfachim in dimensions, that it only has the din of a makom petur? Because if something's 10 tfachim high and it's less than 4 by 4, it's a makom petur. And therefore, if you were to throw something from a rishus harabim onto it, you would be pater. O dilma keven da'asa'o rishus hayachid keman demoli damya. Or maybe no. Maybe since the whole function of the wall is to cause the piece of property that is contained within it as a rishus hayachid, then the wall too has the status of a rishus hayachid, and it's considered to be one solid mass of a rishus hayachid. So Amar Ula kal v'chomer la'acher mosa mechitza la'atzma lo kol shekaim. So Ula says, doesn't it a kal v'chomer? If a wall can turn something else that's adjacent to it into a rishus hayachid, certainly it can turn itself into a rishus hayachid. Itmar nami, it also was stated, Amar Reb Chia bar Ashi Amar Rab, Amar Reb Yitzchak Amar Reb Yechanan, This is confirmed by these Amoraim, that Kosel v'Rishus HaRabim Gavoa Yud, if you have a wall in Rishus HaRabim that's 10 Tvachim high, ve'eno rachiv arba'a, and it's not 4 by 4, u'mukaf l'karmelis, and it's the function of the wall is to enclose a piece of property to make it into a Rishus HaYachid, Rishus HaYachid hazorik v'nachal gabav chayav, that if you throw something and it rests on top of that wall, you're going to be chayiv because you've transferred from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid. Even though the wall does not have the dimensions of a Rishus HaYachid, but since it's causing the adjacent property to become a Rishus HaYachid, then the wall also obtains the status of a Rishus HaYachid. La'cher mosa, because if it's going la'cher mosa mechitza la'atzma l'kolshkein, because if it's creating a Rishus HaYachid status for the property that it contains, that is subsumed within it, then surely for itself it should be a Rishus HaYachid. So now, boy, Rabbi Yochanan asks the next question. Bor tisha v'akar mimena chulya v'hishlima la'asara mahu. Interesting thought question. Let's say you have a pit that's 9 tfachim deep, and you take your handy-dandy shovel, and you scoop out some dirt, and you transfer the dirt to outside the pit. Now, the bore was only 9 tfachim deep when you scooped out the dirt, so you could argue, well, it's not from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. But wait a minute. In the process of scooping out the dirt, you've now made the pit 10 tfachim deep. So there's a simultaneity occurring that's simultaneous to the scooping out of the dirt and bringing it out and doing the akira. Simultaneous with the akira is the formation of this pit as a Rishus HaYachid. So do you say that akiras chayfetz vasiyas mechitza bahadi hadadi ka'asu umichayev? Do you say that they're occurring simultaneously and therefore it is an akira from a Rishus HaYachid and therefore you're chayev because you transferred it to a Rishus HaRabim? Olo michayev, or maybe no, that it's only when you do an akira from a pre-existing 10 tfachim pit do you say that you've done an akira from a Rishus HaYachid. But if they happen concomitantly, then no. Ve'imtim salomar kevin delohavi mechitza asara mi'ikara lo michayv. And if you're going to tell me that no, you're only chayv when you have a pre-existing pit, so let me ask you another question. Bor yud v'nosan l'socha chulya umiyah tamahu. Now let me ask it from the opposite direction. What if you did an akira in Rishus HaRabim of dirt, and you got your shovel and you, instead of taking dirt out of the pit, you're filling the pit with dirt, with earth or with sand. And the pit, before you shovel into it, is 10 tfachim deep. And when you take a shovel full of earth and you put it into the pit, you now have reduced it to make it only 9 tfachim. So the hanacha that is taking place there's a simultaneity between reducing the pit from being a Rishus HaYachid and the hanacha of the earth. So do you say hanacha chayfetz l'siluk mechitza bahadi hadadi ka'asu umichayev? Would you say that if they happen simultaneously you're still going to be chayev? Olo michayev. Or would you say no, that the only time you're chayev is if you do a hanacha on a Rishus HaYachid that is there even after the hanacha takes place? Right, or not? So therefore the Gemara says, Tivsho le'mididei. So let me give you an analogy that will be able to answer this question. Ditnan, the Mishnah says, Hazorek arba amos b'koisel, that if a person throws a projectile for 4 amos and it lands on a wall, so l'mayla me'asar tfachim kizorek ba'avir, that if you throw it above 10 tfachim and it flies through the air and it hits the wall, so then you're going to be so then it's like throwing it in the air and you're going to be potter because it hasn't landed on anything. And lamata me'asara kizarik ba'aretz. The hazarik ba'aretz arba amos chayev. But if you throw it into the air below 10 tfachim and it hits the wall, so then you've achieved your objective, and it's like throwing it onto the earth. And when you throw an object for 4 amos and it lands on the ground, then you're going to be chayev. V'havinan ba, and the question was just raised to clarify this issue. V'halonach, it doesn't come to rest in the place where you had aimed it to do, because anytime you throw a projectile against the wall, it's just going to bounce against the wall and fall to the floor. So v'amar Rabbi Yochanan b'devela shemeina shanina. What we're talking about is a sticky fig, and a sticky fig you throw against the wall and it goes splat, and it sticks to the wall. So the question that we're asking is as follows: Va'amai, well, why should you be chayev in a case where you're exactly 4 amos away? Hakam emayet me arba amos. The Gemara's question is that here conceptually, if you're exactly 4 amos away from the wall and you throw the sticky fig hits the wall, but at the moment that it hits the wall, the mass of the fig is protruding into the 4 amos. So really, at the one end of the fig, it hits the Dalet amos point, but the whole fig is still sticking within the 4. It hasn't traveled the full 4 amos. So why should you be chayiv? So the Gemara wants to say by analogy that it's the same kind of concept, that there's a simultaneity that's taking place here of a reduction of the 4 amos taking place simultaneous with the hanacha, with the object coming to a rest.
Well, why is that one the model? I mean, that one, you could argue that one too.
Well, but that's a Mishnah. That's a Mishnah. So therefore the Gemara says, since it's a Mishnah, we have to use that as our exemplar. And therefore we want to prove from there that even though by shoveling the earth into the ground, you are reducing the 10 tfachim, but since it's happening simultaneously, you're going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says not necessarily so, because hasam lo mevatale, hacha mevatale. Now there are a number of ways that I think there's more than one way that a person could interpret this, but the way it seems from Rashi is that in the case of the fig, you're not taking away the status of the Rishus Harabim that it's coming to rest upon. But over here, hacha mevatale, but over here, you're actually, the shoveling in of the earth removes the prohibited status of the surface where the earth is coming to rest. And as a result, it's not completely analogous, and even if you're chayiv in the case of the sticky fig, you won't necessarily be chayiv in our case. Boy Rava. Rava now asks another really interesting thought question. Zorak DAF v'nachal gabi yisedos mahu. Let's say, now remember, what do you need in order to qualify a Rishus HaYachid? It's got to be some kind of object that is 10 tfachim high and has a floor space of 4 by 4 tfachim. What if I got 4 sticks coming out of the ground that are 10 tfachim high? 4 sticks coming out of the ground. I then take a plank of wood and I have a really good aim and I toss it such that it lands punklach right on top of the 4 sticks. And based upon the principle of good achis, right, that we would say that the plank, which forms the roof of these 4 sticks, creates like imaginary walls that go all the way down, and it creates like a new Rishus HaYachid. But the creation of the Rishus HaYachid happens concomitantly with the landing of the plank on top of the sticks. So that's the question. I've caused the hanacha of the plank simultaneous with the creation of the Rishus HaYachid. So what would I say? So would we say, Mai komi bayale, hanachas chayfetz vasiyas mechitza bahadi hadadi ka'asu, hainu de Rabbi Yochanan. That's Rabbi Yochanan's question. So why, once we haven't answered Rabbi Yochanan's question yet, which is the question where you're diminishing a Rishus HaYachid concomitantly with the object coming to a rest, it's the same question. Or you're creating. The other case was where you're shoveling out earth, where you're creating the Rishus HaYachid concomitantly with the removal, with the act of the Akira. So that's the same question that Rabbi Yochanan had. So why do you have to ask it a different way?
Doesn't it happen, the Rishus HaYachid, even before it, the plank lines on the sticks, because it extends up to the plank as it's traveling?
Well, it's an interesting point. Conceptually, Alan is arguing that as it's on its way down, you can say lavud, and say that even before it actually hits the sticks, it's but then you could say the hanach is also a lavud principle too. I'm not sure. Maybe Tosfos discusses that. I don't know, but it's an interesting concept. So anyway, ki komi ba'ile l'rava kagon dezorak daf v'chayfetz al gabav mai. So the Gemara says no. We're complicating the question a little bit. The question really is, not only did you throw a plank or a board to land on these 4 sticks, but there was a little teddy bear resting on top of the plank. And so you tossed the plank with the teddy bear resting on it through the air. And because of the principles of physics, invariably the plank is going to come to a rest. There'll be a little bounce of the teddy bear, and it'll come to rest on top of the plank a split second after the plank comes to a rest. And therefore, our question is: could you argue So do you say Kevin de Bahadi Hadadi Ka'asu Ka'anachas Chayfetz Tasiyas Mechitza Dami? Then that's considered to be the same kind of simultaneity that we were discussing before. O Dilma Kevin de Lo Efshad Lo Midla Porta V'Hadar Nayach Kasiyas Mechitza V'Hanachas Chayfetz Dami? Or do you say that invariably there's going to be a little bounce of the little teddy bear before, immediate, like for a split second after the plank comes to a rest? Therefore, it's not simultaneous, and therefore it's considered to be the creation of Rishus HaYachid first, and then the hanacha of this object on top of it, and therefore, for sure, you're going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says, take, in all of these cases, we're going to have to let it sit. Amar Rava. Rava now says, Pshitali, it's clear to me that Maim Lagabi Maim Hainu Hanachasa. Now remember, in order to be chayiv, you need a normative akira in one rishus, and a normative hanacha in the opposing rishus. Now, what if you do a hanacha on a surface which is not the normative resting spot? It's not considered to be at rest. So, for example, let's say you put something on instead of doing a hanacha on terra firma, you do hanacha on a conveyor belt. So the Gemara's assumption is doing hanacha on a moving object is not called a real hanacha. Similarly, what if you do hanacha on a body of water, which is in motion? That's not called a real hanacha unless the normal habitat of the object which you're putting to rest is in water. So the Gemara therefore says, placing water on top of water is clearly the normal habitat of water, and therefore if I were to take water from a Rishus Harabim or from and put it, add it to a pre-existing pool of water in a Rishus HaYachid, I'm doing an akira and I'm doing a hanacha that's going to make me liable. So, egos al gabi mayim, but let's say I either pick up a nut that's floating on the water or I put a nut down on top of water. Since the water is moving and a nut does not normally rest in water, that's not called a normative hanacha, and therefore I'm going to be pater. So, but now the question is, the Gemara says, because lav hainu hanachas, that's not its normal resting spot. But boy rava, egos b'chliu klitzaf al gabi mayim mahu. But now the next question, one level of complexity is, what happens if I have a nut that's resting in a can that's resting on the water? So what would be the halacha? Do we look at the nut resting on a stationary surface, or do you look at the can resting on a non-stationary surface? How do you view it? You see that? You see, in other words, if you look only at the nut, isolate, you only pose the camera on the nut, so the nut looks like it's on a flat, stationary surface, because relative to the nut, it's stationary. But relative to the outside of the can is moving. So therefore, mahu miyam rinan basar egos oslinan. That do we say that relative to the nut, the can is a stationary surface, and therefore it's normative for the nut to rest in the can, and therefore if you place the nut in the can on Shabbos, you've done a malacha. V'hanayach odilma basar kliyas linan v'halonayach. Or do you go relative to the can in the water, which is placing the can in the water is not normative because the can is not now at rest, then not on a stationary terra firma, therefore it's not called a hanacha. So the Gemara says teiku. The last thing the Gemara says on this subject is that shemen al gabe yayin machlokes, that if you have oil floating on wine, since oil and wine don't mix, this is a machlokes whether oil resting on top of wine is considered to be its normative resting spot, in which case if you were to place oil on top of wine on Shabbos, you'd be chayiv for a hanacha, or not. So, and what's the machlokes? It's the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan. Nan, as the Mishnah says, shemen shetzaf al gabi yayin. If you have oil floating on top of wine, the nagat fulyom b'shemen, and a person who's tameh touches the shemen. So the question is the shemen considered to be normatively resting on top of wine like water rests on top of water? If so, then by him touching the oil, then the wine also becomes tameh. But the Tanakama says no, he doesn't make it tameh because the oil is not normatively considered resting on top of wine, and therefore the only thing that becomes possible is Elashem is the oil. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer Shneim Chibur Zelazeh. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri disagrees, and he says no. the oil and the wine are considered to be connected. That's their normative. It's normal for them, one to be resting on top of each other, and therefore that's considered to be a hanacha. And therefore, just like the person was telling me, when he touches the oil also is matami the wine, so too if you deposit oil on top of wine on Shabbos, you've done a normative hanacha, and therefore you're going to be chayiv. Have a wonderful day.